We should start. We have Dr. Siri Gamage here with us. But before we start, perhaps we should just do a bit of introduction, see who's here, and say something about ourselves. Because Siri is definitely interested in meeting people who are working on issues of multiculturalism and multicultural education. I know most of you, or all of you. My name is Handel Wright. I'm director for the Center for Culture, Identity and Education, and also David Lamb Chair for Multicultural Education. And this is one of our several events we'll be having over the term of the Multicultural Chair. And just to put in a plug, we're planning, and we haven't got all the details down yet. Constantine will be hearing from us soon. You don't know it yet, but you'll be hearing from us. We're planning a one-day, full-day symposium on African ways of knowing that we're hoping to do sometime in November, and that will be also that will involve both graduate students' work and professors' work, faculty work within education. But I want us to just kind of go around, kind of informally just say who we are, and I'll introduce Siri last. So if you want to start.
My name is Daniela Elza, and I am in the Department of Education, Curriculum Theory and Implementation at SFU. And it's going to be interesting, actually.
That's okay.
I'm also from SFU, and my name is Nara Potake, and I'm teaching Japanese at SFU, and I'm a former student of CCIE.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I'm Graham Smith from Educational Studies via New Zealand. Just checking that one.
My name is Michelle Fidget. I'm a PhD student in Educational Studies.
Dan Brown, Professor Emeritus in Educational Studies, Educational Leadership at UBC.
I'm Ron Jobe, and I'm in the Department of Language and Literacy, and I teach children's literature, of which multicultural literature is part, and been to Australia many times, actually on a yearly basis, to connect with the children's lit people there. And you have a lot of leeches up by your area, there's parking up there, don't you?
I'm Konstantin Gara. I'm a PhD student in educational counseling psychology and special education. I'm very interested on issues of diversity in giftedness. Hence my interest in participating in this workshop.
Bernie Bezanson. I'm a PhD student in counseling psychology, and my research focuses on providing culturally sensitive therapy to people with things and cross-cultural relationships.
I'm Hayne Way. I'm a sessional in Educational Studies.
Marian Korath. I'm a professor in educational and counseling psychology and special education, and share Constantine's interest in diverse ways of defining giftedness and supporting it.
I'm Claude Olsen. I'm a visiting scholar for a year in studies from Charles Sturt University at Bathurst. My work looks at the relationship between education policy, urban change and identity.
Okay. But thanks, everyone. There's still...
Betty.
No, it's okay. Hi. You're just in time to introduce yourself. So to put you on the spot. That's what I'm doing.
But also the white refreshments.
Yeah.
Serious, I'm Barry Morrison at the Institute of Asian Research, Emeritus.
Thanks for being here. Well, we have with us today Dr. Siri Gamage, who is a senior lecturer at the University of New England in Australia. He's cross-appointed there between the School of Education and the School of Professional Development and Leadership. And he teaches multiculturalism and multicultural education. He also teaches immigrant studies and the social context of schooling. Dr. Gamage's research interests range from globalization to intercultural studies, from critical multiculturalism to race theory and the social context of education, and more recently in multiculturalism across countries. Siri was born in Sri Lanka and taught sociology there until he immigrated to Australia in 1986. And he started teaching at New England in 1990, I believe. He has conducted research on the adaptation experiences of Sri Lankans in Australia. And his interests are turning lately to critical approaches to multiculturalism, to issues of hybridity and diversity, and to comparative multiculturalism, which is why we've emailed back and forth a little bit. Dr. Gamage is currently on sabbatical and touring the world, probably is how to put it. He's with us for I don't know how much longer, a few days more only, right?
This week.
Yeah, just this week. And then going down to Toronto, to York University. He's an associate faculty of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education, which I head. And so he's currently visiting the center and also currently visiting the Department of Educational Studies, which is also my home department. And today I'll let Siri introduce his topic. And I'm sure that those of you who are interested in issues of multiculturalism, you might have something to say to him, and he might have things to say to you. He'll speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we can have questions and answers after that. So, over to you, Siri. Yeah, sure, about 45 minutes.
All right. Thanks, Handel, for that very generous introduction. It may sound very big to you in terms of all those things he described, but I'm a very simple hybrid Australian Sri Lankan. Okay. I must first of all thank Handel for organizing this seminar through his center and kindly offered to do this, and I'm very grateful for that. And thank you also for turning up for this particular seminar, and I appreciate your time and so on. Now, I have prepared a little reading list, I mean in a sense of some key couple of writings in this area, and I would like to circulate it to you. I forgot to add that there's a very good article in the handbook edited by James Bankettel on Australian multicultural education and multiculturalism. So I, in fact, couldn't add there, but I would recommend that also as a sort of good profile about multicultural education, multicultural policy and its history and so on in the Australian context. Now, I think I must use these overheads. Sometimes they help me to navigate through these topics in some ways. My topic today is, can all of you read this? Okay. Changing nature of Australian multiculturalism and its implications for ethnic minorities and multicultural education. Of course, when we look at ideas like, concepts like multiculturalism, I mean that can be handled at different levels. One can handle it as a sort of community concept, a concept which is vibrant and living within people themselves, or one can handle it as a sort of political concept, or even a culturally significant concept, or even as a sort of instrument. We can handle it at the policy level also, whether it be generic multicultural policy level or even specific areas like multicultural education and so on. So for the purpose of my presentation today, I choose to look at somewhat extensively in terms of the multicultural policy and to some extent multicultural education policies as well. When I make this presentation today, I just like to make one more introductory point, that is about the way Australian governments are organized. Now we have a federal government based in Canberra basically, and then we have about 5 states and 2 territories. And politically speaking, the federal government has been for the last 10 years or so, politically the government is a liberal, national, one would say conservative government. Whereas in all the 5 states and 2 territories, the governments are Labour governments for the most part of the last 10 years and so on. So when I present these materials to you today, I will be using that distinction in terms of multicultural policy as well. I will be looking at federal multicultural policy on one hand, and then of course to some extent state government multicultural education policies. Okay. Now, of course, I come from a sort of social science, sociology background, and that's my disciplinary background, and so I tend to look at some of these concepts and ideologies and policies from a sort of sociological point of view. But even if you look at it from a political or any other social science perspectives, we know that ideologies and policies are historical and political constructs. Generally, those who got power either in government or in the society by using other criteria, they determine, perhaps after a period of negotiation and so on, they determine what the shape of their policy or ideology should be. Because those who have power, basically have a lot of influence and decision-making power in terms of what the public would think and what kind of political discourses they would adopt, and how to use media by using perhaps millions of dollars in terms of advertising campaigns and so on and so on. So that is a starting point I would like to make in terms of this particular topic. And then in countries like Australia, Canada, and English-speaking world, basically settled societies, when as a result of the immigration and the cultural diversity brought about by that, of course governments and communities, the already living communities, had to respond to this cultural diversity brought about by the immigration, post-war immigration basically. And these governments, whether Labour or Liberal and so on, and the communities respond to this cultural diversity in different ways, in different times, depending on how they conceptualize the cultural diversity and its nature, and what kind of threats or challenges they bring into the sort of already existing social and political structures in the society and the community structures, and what they value and so on. So they generally respond differently to different cultural diversity phenomena. And as in this process, as governments change, new directions and emphasis in the policy are introduced. And basically they take community feelings and sentiments into account, the majority, perhaps powerful community sentiments and feelings into account. And generally speaking, because these societies are governed by democratic political systems, of course the politicians and leaders have to take into account the majority opinion, significant opinions. And so, when we look at the Australian context also later on in my presentation, this will become evident. So in this presentation, I will look at the changing meanings and emphasis in government policy, multicultural policy, and we'll bring in some views from the published literature to provide a picture of the status of multiculturalism, and then of course I will also add my observations as I go along. So in a sense, when we look at Australian multiculturalism, which started around early 1970s during Malcolm Crane's prime ministership, I mean, when we can look at the history of this particular policy and its evolution and the way it has been changing over from that time onwards. But I'm not going to do that now because it is impossible to cover the whole period during a seminar like this. But that paper, which is listed in these readings by Galligan and Roberts, 2003, which you can download from the internet, is a very good paper which I recommend for you to have a look at it, because I mean they basically examine the whole evolution of multicultural policy from the 1970s and up to a current point of time. By recommending that paper, I don't necessarily agree with some of the views and ideas expressed in that particular paper, but then generally as a sort of a good to get a good grasp of how the policy has been changing, that paper would be ideal. What I will do today is I will look at the Labour government period led by Hawke and Keating Prime Ministers from 1983 to 1996. And then of course Liberal National Government led by John Howard, Prime Minister, John Howard since 1996. So basically, I mean, that's the kind of division I will use in my presentation. Am I going too fast or no? All right. So in a sense, I mean, when we look at that history of multicultural policy and the idea, concept of multiculturalism, and by the way, I mean, the concept of multiculturalism in Australia was borrowed initially from Canada, and perhaps some of you know about that historical aspect. Now, it started as a series of policy measures designed to assist migrants becoming Australian without jettisoning their previous cultural heritage. That was the important aspect of it. And it was a dominant policy and ideology during Fraser years since 1975 and Labour years since 1983. So as I mentioned before, cultural and ethnic diversity brought about by immigration and the need to address settlement issues of new immigrants, that were the sort of motivating factors for introducing a multicultural policy aspect. Of course, in the Australian context, multicultural policy developed closely with the immigration policy, and it was always, and for the most part, I mean, the immigration department had a big say, but later during the Labour years and also during the Fraser years, there were some generic Office of Multicultural Affairs or Ethnic Affairs under the Premier's department as well. So these two policies, immigration and multicultural policies, had a very close relationship. In a sense, immigration policy was trying to address, I mean, how many immigrants to be brought into the country and what kind of categories like skilled and refugees and so on, whereas the multicultural policy tended to look at or address issues post-settlement issues of immigrants, and how to integrate the immigrants together with the other Australian community and so on. When we look at the concept of multiculturalism, whether it is as appearing in the policy or as appearing as a sort of community ideology in the society or in the media and so on, we find this kind of tension between multiculturalism as a descriptive term to refer to the cultural diversity in the society, or as a prescriptive term about what the culture and identity should be in the society. The national identity and national culture should be in the society. Now, that distinction is very useful, conceptual distinction is a very useful one for me in presenting my materials today. Now, during the Labour years, even Galligan and Roberts mentioned in their paper, and I, as a sort of Australian citizen who have been living in Australia for about 20 years, I have witnessed that during the Labour years, it was used in a kind of prescriptive sense, more than in a descriptive sense. So when I say it is a descriptive sense, it means that, you know, multiculturalism acknowledges and refers to the cultural diversity in the society, but doesn't go beyond that. It just only acknowledges. Whereas prescriptive sense, it means it becomes a sort of norm or kind of a desired ideal for the society and to society to have, and the kind of benefits it brings in, and as a sort of concept, an idea with a sort of intrinsic value in itself, rather than a sort of descriptive one. So this distinction, of course, during the labor years, because the labor governments were pushing somewhat hard this idea of multiculturalism by using various kind of other paraphernalia and institutional framework and also resources, even in the area of multicultural education, including ESL and LOT education and so on. I mean, a lot of people from the mainstream, particularly those who are disgruntled and affected by the globalizing forces, started to criticize that kind of idea, kind of prescriptive notion of multiculturalism. Now let me take you to the agenda for multicultural Australia. We chose a sort of basic key policy document and policy expression of multiculturalism during the labor years. Now 1986 agenda. Now cultural identity was one of the three principles. Cultural identity. By that it meant that the people, immigrants and others, they are able to express their cultural identity within carefully defined limits. That's exactly how it was mentioned in the policy document at the time. And cultural identity was one of the three principles of multiculturalism as it was conceptualized at the time. And the other two were social justice and economic efficiency. Social justice, by that they meant the immigrants also to be provided with equal opportunities and without discrimination by race and blah. By economic efficiency, they meant the idea of utilizing the culturally diverse human resources for the benefit of the nation. So, in a sense, that cultural identity component was utilized by proponents of multiculturalism during the labor years. To say that Australia is multicultural. People can. The government recognizes the differences in culture and identity and so on, and it allows this freedom to happen. And therefore, Australia is a multicultural society, and its institutions and processes should reflect this kind of expression of cultural identities and differences in cultural identities and so on, including some of the writers, multicultural writers also, academics and others, various conferences and so on. Through that, they promoted this idea, and immigrant communities also cling on, they also use that idea as a sort of policy prescription, and then also made various demands from the government also for their welfare and various settlement needs and whatnot. Now, some of the other features during that period, I'm talking about the labor years. There was a strong access and equity program in terms of government service provision, and there were monitoring mechanisms about that, and there was a push for Australians becoming Asia literate, and because Australia is located in the Asian region, the idea was that we need to be not only doing trade, but to have good relations with Asian countries, we need to learn their languages, and there were programs in terms of languages other than English, and also along with ESL programs. And then, of course, under the Prime Minister's office, there was the Office of Multicultural Affairs, coordinating all the multicultural programs and activities, and giving it also a kind of a clout in the government hierarchy, rather than limiting it to the sort of immigration department. And also, I would say, compared to today, better post-settlement services for new immigrants, including giving them English language classes, and also welfare in terms of settling in period. Support for teaching community languages, of course, that continues even today. I would say, that was a prominent feature at the time, and as a result, ethnic communities started teaching their own languages with some government support. I would say state government support on weekends, and even today that continues around various schools. Maintenance of cultural diversity was a key focus at the time. This idea of cultural diversity, and it was used, perhaps at the beginning of Labour years rather than towards the end when Paul Keating was Prime Minister. The cultural diversity maintenance, that's the key word there, maintenance of cultural diversity was emphasized at the time, rather than considering it as a sort of demographic fact only. Cultural difference was appreciated. Becoming Australian with the difference was possible, under that kind of policy. I'm talking about how people, basically immigrants and their children felt at the time. Because of this government policy, acceptance and acknowledgement of difference, people generally felt, I'm talking about the Sri Lankan immigrants basically, who I have been doing some research as well, felt included in the political system and in the society. Even if there were some critics in the society about, migrants and, multiculturalism and so on, when the government had this kind of inclusive program of policies, then of course the new immigrants felt comfortable with that. Government was seen as too close to however now the criticism was government was seen too close to minority groups and their interests, needs at the time, because there were state-based ethnic community councils, and also there was a sort of umbrella organization called Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils. It exists even today. They were basically negotiating with the immigration minister and other politicians about what should be done and what program should be done, where should the money go and what kind of funds are needed to do what, and so on and so on. So in a sense, that was the sort of arrangement during the Labour years. Mind you, those who know about the Labour Party, it also has a factional system, and also, basically, they have been trying to get the ethnic vote by using these kind of methods as well. So that was the criticism in a sense. And sections of the mainstream who were alienated, as I said before, by globalization processes, felt vulnerable, and vulnerable not because of the immigrants, but because of various other things happening. They were losing banks in their country town areas and various other government outlets, service outlets and so on. And also people were losing their jobs as a result of redundancies in telecom and various other government sponsored organizations, and people felt vulnerable at the time, and then of course they saw immigrants and ethnics as the cause of their ills. And then of course this particular anxiety in the Australian society found its expression through that Pauline Hanson phenomena towards later on, and I'll come to that in my presentation as well. So this is, in a nutshell, some of the features of that time, and this quote from Gilligan and Roberts is useful here. It says, by the end of 1980s, multiculturalism had become a blueprint for all Australians. It was linked less specifically to migrant settlement services and more to celebrating and accepting culture difference within Australian society. Citizenship was defined in terms of abstract civic values with an emphasis on tolerance and diversity that people from different cultures could share. There was a suspicion that multiculturalism was being foisted on the community and immigration policy was being used to bolster it. He just basically narrates the kind of anxiety that I referred to here. Now let me turn to the Liberal National Government years. Just some points to highlight what's happening during that period over the last 10 years or so. So that paper by Galligan and Roberts also highlight this factor very well. During Harvard years, multiculturalism has been downside to the descriptive meaning rather than the prescriptive meaning. I mean, when he came to power, and after about 3-4 years, especially when Pauline Hanson phenomena started to bite into the sort of conservative vote, I mean, he started appropriating Hanson agenda in slowly but systematically, and then, of course, as a result, the moves by Harvard government were reflected in the multicultural policy as well. I mean, instead of multiculturalism as a prescription for what Australian nation should be and what Australian culture should be and how Australia should operate, I mean, it became a sort of descriptive meaning. It was downsized to a certain extent, and other factors have taken priority. For example, importance given to cultural identity has been minimized in the national agenda for multicultural Australia now, for recent times. That agenda has been revised every 3 years. So I'm just using the one which is current, and I'll come to that in the next overview. Now basically, if we look at the leadership, Prime Minister Howard avoided using the multiculturalism word, and in fact I would say that during his government multiculturalism as an issue has been marginalized as well. It's not considered as something which needs particular attention or particular government response or whatever it is, emphasis or whatever it is. Immediately after he came to power, he abolished the Office of Multicultural Affairs, and very recently Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Commission as well. It deals with policy and program matters in relation to the Aboriginal people in Australia. The Bureau of Immigration Research was also abolished. That was the peak body conducting research, commission research as well about the settlement issues and inequalities that immigrants and their children and so on face in the Australian society as they try to make a living there. And of course, that research fed directly into the sort of policy making process at the government level at that time. But he abolished that one. Emphasized common political values and national unity. These authors say this was what had become of multiculturalism during Keating years also. Now, Keating was the Prime Minister of Australia just before Howard came to power. In fact, now even though I am using this particular 2 periods, I mean, I would say that the economic rationalist policies in Australia, as well as, I mean, in a sense, a little bit downgrading of multiculturalism happened during Keating years as well, and Galligan and Roberts also acknowledge that. And so, in a sense, when we look at today, I mean, in other aspects, one can't clearly see a distinction between the liberal and labor policies in other areas. But whereas when we come to multiculturalism, we could detect some of the major differences. In the revised agenda for multicultural Australia, what is emphasized is citizenship. Australian citizenship. And also in terms of the managerial arrangements, citizenship and multicultural affairs have been combined. The Minister for Multicultural and Citizenship Affairs. In fact, Howard's years, I mean, he appropriated, as I said, Hanson's agenda and constituency in and around 1998. Politically, it was expedient for Liberal National government to appease the mainstream instead of ethnic minorities because it brought more votes. Now, as you may have heard, I mean, new migrants do not get government assistance for 2 years under this particular government, and also they have to pay for their English classes and tests prior to arrival. And of course, I mean, lately after September 11 and so on, the government has been adopting an anti-terrorism discourse and anti-terrorism law. And this should be tough on refugees rather than And now the political discourse in Australia is organized along, the Australian and Muslim binary. the Muslims are the potential terrorists and we are the Australians. And Australians are vulnerable and Australians are the victim. And we are the immigrants, Muslim background, and they are the sort of, potential terrorists and so on. Whereas in the previous Labour years, I mean, the dominant discourse was multicultural discourse, no terrorism or anything like that. And whereas now, I mean, the whole discourse has been turned into this one, and I can see it, I mean, even to some extent in USA as well and Britain also. And so I can also see that, to some extent, I mean, the government seems to, not only after September 11 and other Bali terrorist attacks, but generally in Australia I can see that, I mean, there's a kind of a tendency for celebrating war. And so that comes from the sort of World War II period and of course celebration of, Anzac heroes and, the remaining diggers and, giving them a sort of good feeling during Anzac Day and various other programs and so on. Somehow or other, I mean, the heroism that these people displayed during war and even subsequent wars, and the Australian character is basically linked with this kind of attitude. So along with all these, I mean, there are diminished resources for multicultural programs and except for Harmony Day. Now there is around in March, I think there's a Harmony Day. There again, I mean, it is nothing more than, I mean, having a sort of good time and, get some good food and so on. Government gives $3.6 million to the whole country, and there are various groups around, various through local councils and so on. They conduct Harmony Day. I mean, there is nothing wrong with that, but then, I mean, it's the absolute minimum in a sense, in any society. But in terms of other programs, which were vibrant during Labour years, in a sense, I mean, in terms of multicultural education, maybe learning of languages other than English, those programs, Asia literacy and so on, I mean, the resources have been diminished. In a sense, then, what is happening now is migrants are expected, in fact required, I would say, I mean, in a certain sense, to follow Australian way of life. Australian way of life, and this is reflected in various talkback radio programs as well and media writings, journal, newspaper articles and so on. So especially I listen to the one program at night every day because I can listen to average of Aussies, I mean, through that program, all kinds of people into that, called Graham Gilbert Show, which is broadcasted from Sydney, and it goes on for about midnight. Generally what the sentiment is expressed there is, including the radio host, is that when we as Australians go to Iraq or Iran or Singapore, any other countries, we have to abide by whatever the rules and customs and so on and so on. So why not all these immigrants, when they come to our country, also abide by our Australian way of life? So that's the argument. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But the question is, what is this Australian way of life? Now, it is not defined in any sense by the government. Just before I left this time, about 3 weeks or so ago, I mean, the government is going to prepare a list of values, Australian values. It has commissioned some group to come up with some kind of list. So new immigrants will be required to sign this list of values as they come. Whether they agree with, sign a piece of paper, basically. And the Labour leader made a terrible mistake because, at this time, he's trying to, outdo the government in terms of whatever the policies they propose. He even suggested that if he comes to power, he will ask the visitors also to sign the list of values. And then the government ministers criticized him, saying that if I go to Indonesia, does it mean that I have to sign to a list of values prepared by Indonesian government or something like that? So I'm just sidetracking here. Sorry about that. But the key is here, the Australian way of life. Now I tried to find some definition of Australian way of life through some other sources. And so the question about the Australian way of life is which one? Is it consumerist lifestyle? I mean, in Australia, I mean, including me, I'm a taxpayer, I pay bills, and most of my life is basically devoted to that these days as a consumerist. Of course, it is the same wherever you go. And is it Anglo-Australian way of life? So is it playing football, drinking beer, going to pubs and so on? Absolutely. Very important. I found this particular paragraph from this Contemporary Australia course, National Identity, Monash University, National Centre for Australian Studies. It says the Australian way of life is seen as reflecting traditional values of egalitarianism, classlessness, the fair go, stoicism. What does it mean? Do you know? Stoicism? And again, mateship. It is sometimes referred to as the national ethos, whereby a certain lifestyle is seen as central to the welfare of the whole community, not just one class of society. The shared ethos of leisure and the quarter-acre block is one articulation of the Australian way of life. So, I mean, I would say, egalitarianism, classlessness, fair go, these are good qualities in the Australian society. I have seen it, I have experienced it, and by presenting all these differences between Labour and Liberal governments in terms of multicultural policy, I am not in any way trying to denigrate Australian society, culture, or its people. There are a lot of good qualities in Australia in comparison to particularly some of the other countries around the world where governments are either dictatorships or people are not given their due rights and so on. But the point is, I'm presenting this, making this presentation about Australia, and then I'm trying to adopt a sort of critical attitude towards the policy frameworks within Australia itself. So therefore, please understand that imperative. So to go back to these authors, Galligan and Roberts, it says multiculturalism is now more used by governments at national and state levels as rhetoric of community relations that aims at social cohesion. By 2001 election, multiculturalism had been effectively gutted as a national policy. In cultural terms, it had been reduced to acknowledging diversity by its architects and political leaders. That diversity was not that of enduring separate cultures, but of an enriched and more pluralistic national culture that was predominantly English-speaking and derived from earlier British and Irish migrants. In policy terms, multiculturalism has become an invocation of Australian democratic values and political institutions. Probably he is also referring here to the idea of emphasizing citizenship in the new agenda for revised agenda for multicultural Australia. So now, in a sense, one of the broader questions we can raise here is now with this policy shift. I would say, in the new agenda for multicultural Australia, there is a section on terrorism also. And the reason why the Harvard government, through that policy, is asking for good community relations and social harmony is because there is a threat of terrorism. So, in order to avoid that, he says, terrorism can be a sort of homegrown thing, and therefore, we need to get good community relations. Not because multiculturalism or cultural diversity has any intrinsic value or anything like that as before, but because this terrorism thing. So now one of the broader questions we can raise here is, are we going in the direction of a melting pot kind of idea? When we suggest that, okay, now become Australian, follow Australian ways, and don't try to maintain your distinctive cultural identities and practices and so on. Or are we going in the direction of assimilation to dominant culture and identity? This is a broader question one can raise, but that's not my main focus here. And I really want to emphasize something else in terms of implications of this shift on multicultural education and so on. So just to reiterate again, the main shift in the federal policy is seems to be, this is in a sense my reading of the policy shift, from affirming diversity and difference during the labor years, as used to be, to affirming Australianness, undefined to some extent, and citizenship. Citizenship, I'll show another slide in terms of what it means technically in the policy documents and so on later. But this shift is reflected in political discourses by the leaders. Now, for example, Prime Minister says, in one radio interview we mentioned that we can't have a federation of cultures in the country. Of course, it's a federation of states at the moment, but he was using the same terminology. National debate has moved to issues of citizenship and refugee policy, terrorism, etc. Before, during the labor years, I would say multiculturalism plus nationalism was the kind of a critical ideological platform, whereas now it is anti-terrorism and nationalism. Nationalism is there, I mean, it is hidden. I mean, when during the labor years, when they were talking about, leaders were talking about multiculturalism, basically, I mean, there was some implications about nationalism as well. But now when they talk about anti-terrorism and the need to safeguard the nation and our borders and so on, it has certain implications for nationalism as well. I mean, so I'm not going to details about that particular combination here because it's a kind of a political, sociological kind of concept. This shift is reflected in lack of federal government institutions and programs for research, policy development, implementation and monitoring as before. So I mentioned before about the abolition of Bureau of Immigration Research and Office of Multicultural Affairs and so on. Now they haven't been replaced with something else. There's a vacuum there. Shifting focus of government policy from ethnic minority issues to mainstream issues. So that is the shift. Government funding is largely directed to building national monuments and programs which have little multicultural content or relevance. That also is something that I can observe in the country. I mean, it has been going on there before also. But you may remember, I mean, if you know about the bicentenary celebrations in Australia, I mean, during that time there was a lot of course, celebration of Anglo-Australian cultural history and, experiences and iconic matters and so on. But along with that, there was a celebration of cultural diversity and multiculturalism as well at the time, in a grand scale. But nothing like that is seen now. No special favors or benefits merely because one is culturally different. So that's the kind of general tendency that I can see there. So I will probably use another 5 minutes or so for just to give you a flavor of current national agenda. I won't read that, but it basically talks about the loyalty to Australia, and then immigrants, when they become citizens, they have to pledge loyalty to basic structures and principles underlying the democratic society. They include constitution, parliamentary democracy, freedom of speech, that is under a cloud at the moment. Because of this anti-terrorism legislation, people don't know whether if they speak out on issues, they will be treated as treason. English as a national language and blah blah blah. The four principles of government's multicultural policy still has right to express own culture and beliefs and to respect others' culture and beliefs. That angle, the cultural identity angle I explained before, the 1988 agenda. And these are some other. But what is more interesting now is, when we look at the state multicultural education policy documents, what I find is remarkable is that, whereas the federal government is emphasizing this terrorism, the need for community relations, and immigrants to become citizens, and citizenship is defined in political, techno-legal terms and so on. Whereas the federal government is defining multicultural policy in that way, the state governments which are led by liberal parties, are still basically continuing that kind of labor kind of thinking. Just to give you some examples, just these are some quotes from multicultural education policies. Victoria, in Victorian state, it says it promotes cultural pluralism as a dynamic and enriching social value. Cultural pluralism, which is a little bit different kind of thing compared to multiculturalism, because in a sort of cultural diversity sense, because cultural pluralism, the idea of cultural pluralism is basically about multiculturalism in a prescriptive sense. And encourages respect for all cultures and so on. The guidelines have been developed to provide an overview of government policies and department initiatives that affirm cultural and linguistic diversity. Affirming. See now, when I was describing the federal government policy before, I mentioned about how it was shifted from affirming cultural diversity to basically Australianness or embracing Australian way of life, whereas the state government in Victoria's policy that is that one. This is more interesting, Queensland one, because it talks about the cultural diversity in relation to the power dynamics as well, inequality and power dynamics and so on, and also says this paragraph is very important. This imbalance in power and status between different groups in society can lead to the devaluing of cultural diversity, which results in a society in which the power of the dominant culture remains unquestioned and unchanged, leaving no space for other cultures to participate equally in the shaping of national identity and citizenship. That's a very important paragraph, I would say. Coming from a sort of state government, multicultural education policy, supposedly they have to fall into line with the federal government policy, but somehow or other in Australia we have this let's say, difference between state governments and the different powers. So that's a good thing in a sense, because I mean the federal government cannot dominate the whole agenda in a sense, you know. New South Wales also basically, I mean, falls into line with the national government policy, but then they have some paragraphs like this, you know, respect and make provision for the culture, language, and so on. The usual things, multicultural education aims to develop the knowledge, skills, and so on and so on. Now, finally, I think you must be bored with all these overheads now, but I will just end with this implications aspect. Implications of this shift that I can detect in multicultural policy federal level. Of course, the implication of shift from prescriptive to descriptive. As I said before, instead of affirming cultural diversity and differences and so on, just recognition only, we can argue that this kind of shift devalues cultural diversity in the context of the nation, national culture and identity. I mean, they just recognize it is a culturally diverse society, but that's where it ends. Is that enough? No recognition of, another thing I notice is that, you know, I mean, in societies like Canada, US, Britain and New Zealand and Australia and so on, we talk about hybrid identities. These immigrants, particularly their children, when they grow up here and they assume a kind of a hybrid identity, there is no recognition of this in the multicultural policy. And is it because, I mean, is it considered as a sort of threat if it is recognized? Or does it dilute the sort of kind of national identity and culture that the politicians and other writers are trying to build up? And the other implication is ethnicity and culture-based identities are not considered as categories or groupings deserving specific policy attention or responses due to political and community sentiments. What could be the result of this? I mean, like before, if we ask the ethnic communities or the immigrants and their children to either sink or swim, without giving them assistance, either in education terms or in other settlement terms and so on, I mean, what could be the result of that? In fact, some groups can alienate from the social structures and processes. We saw end of last year, there was a Cronulla riot in Cronulla Beach. I mean, obviously you may have seen those pictures. I mean, the trigger for that riot would have been something, something said and done by some Lebanese Muslim youths to the sort of beach boys and girls, in the Cronulla Beach. It's a very popular beach. But when it erupted like that, and when there were text messages sent around by the Anglo-Australian people, youths and others, and got them about 5,000 people around on one weekend to the Cronulla Beach and so on. They used Australian flags, and they bashed a couple of Lebanese youth people, and of course police played a very important role. They are saving their lives. I mean, and then following that, there was a sort of return attack by the Lebanese youths going in 40 cars and something like that, and bashing some cars in the Cronulla Beach area and so on and so on. I mean, that shows that something is not working in the society, and the politicians and the policy makers are not really looking at the deeper questions in the society in terms of ethnic relations and multiculturalism and so on. And what was the state government's response? To bring in a new law. If somebody goes with these kind of attacking kind of paraphernalia, I mean, if they are caught and charged, then they could be sent to jail for 20 years or something like that. Of course, there were some other measures also taken by the communities themselves. They came into some kind of joint committee or something, and then tried to, settle the situation. As I said before, community harmony is emphasized because of terrorism, not because of any intrinsic value of different cultures, histories and identities of individuals. And what about including these, that when we look at the critical multicultural education literature and so on, we talk about including different cultures, histories and identities, and there are information about them in curriculum and so on. What kind of support this federal government policy is giving to that kind of ideas? Media policy corresponding to this policy, multicultural policy, is an advertisement asking people to become citizens. I mean, you can see that most of the time in Australian media, asking them to become citizens. But the key question is, even Gallagher and Roberts, they refer to this idea. I mean, what they are saying is this, the way citizenship is defined at the moment is as a technical, legal kind of concept, I mean, when you become a citizen, you gain certain rights, and also you have certain responsibilities. When I became a citizen last year, early this year, in fact, I felt the same way. I mean, there is no cultural content in the citizenship idea. Or, I mean, basically, I mean, you are congratulated for becoming a citizen, and you are given some kind of presents, which includes a sort of little medal with Australian emblem and so on. And there is nothing else, and you can get an Australian passport, and of course that's it. And then of course they ask you to express your loyalty to the democratic institutions and so on. By the way, I got 3 letters from 3 politicians also. And I got my citizenship and congratulate them, and you can understand the sentiment. It's kind of a political kind of concept in a sense, because I mean, the more people become citizens, the more voting public will be there. Perhaps many of those who don't understand how the Australian democratic system works and so on. Media policy, just explain marginalization of multicultural studies at universities, multicultural education even. It has been, earlier there were teacher training programs and diplomas and degrees and so on, even in my university in multicultural studies, but they have gone out of the window for so many years now. And multiculturalism education is taught as part of larger units. I mean, that's a tendency in Australian higher education now. Yeah, question they raise, cultural content in citizenship and making it more relevant. How can we make it more relevant? If citizenship the focal point in the current multicultural policy, how can we make it more relevant concept and idea for people? These 2 authors, they suggest that it should be basically, Anglo-Irish culture and identity should reflect that identity. But what about multicultural identity or multicultural citizenship? what about other community values in the Australian society? I mean, for example, in Australia we have a great tradition of voluntarism, and Australians do a lot of voluntary work, in fact a lot of sacrifices, and why don't we bring that kind of idea? Can't we educate people to do more voluntary work if they are immigrants who become citizens and so on? Like that, I mean, it throws a lot of questions, and it raises a lot of questions and so on. I hope I have been able to give you a little bit of a feel about the evolution of multicultural policy and so on. Perhaps sometimes I may have been harsh on some aspects, but you know, that's how I read it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One apple juice. There's coffee and stuff, but otherwise, let's just have a bit of a chat. I'm sure Siri will be particularly interested in maybe if people see some similarities or differences with the Canadian situation. He's interested in getting some of those kinds of issues also on the table. So, great.
Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I enjoyed your presentation. I think you've been a bit soft, actually. I think you can clean up those Aussies a bit more. But my question really relates to two aspects, which, and I'm just wondering if you deliberately de-emphasised them, so you sort of actually hinted at the ideology aspect of it in your title. But you know, it really relates to: are we seeing the sort of, you know, part of this is actually an unfolding of you know, the imagined community, the unfolding of governmentality, those kinds of notions at the ideological level, which is being driven by the structural elements, the structural imperative. And